So I'm joined today by Rasmus Bech Hansen, the CEO and founder of Airfinity. Airfinity is a consultancy that has done a lot of work on looking at the rollout of vaccines. And maybe just very briefly, Rasmus, you could explain a little bit what Airfinity does and why you have taken such a deep interest in vaccines. And I've come across you because you've been doing such deep work in this that has been quite predictive of where the rollout of vaccines is happening. What is your background? What is Airfinity? And then we'll get quickly into some of the most recent findings.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Really excited to be here, and thank you for inviting me in. So we call ourselves a science analytics company. We really set up a platform that listens to all new science signals around the world in real time, and then we do what's called meta-analysis also in real time to understand what are the implications of the new scientific results. We listen to some of the new channels, preprints, social media, press. We also listen to conferences, and we set the company up 4 or 5 years ago because we felt it was difficult for anyone to really answer the question what happens in a scientific area with lots of progress in right now. And so when COVID-19 came, we started applying our platform to this new space, and we saw this avalanche of new science coming out, and our platform was very well suited for that. So we've been fortunate to support vaccine task forces around the world, large organizations like the UN, the IMF, and also pharmaceutical industry with real-time insights and predictions for where the COVID-19 pandemic is going from a scientific, so from a solution perspective, if you wish.
Great. Okay, so let's cut straight to the chase. When will there be enough vaccines to inoculate the world?
Well, so that's very, very far off, unfortunately, right? I think we've generally been too optimistic, and we still are a little too optimistic around when we'll have vaccines enough. Like, we've done many estimates and forecasts on this, and I just looked recently before the call this morning, and we had by some with people called pessimistic estimate that we would have 600 million vaccines by now. The real number is around 150 million. So we are still kind of producing much less than we thought we would at this point. So at the current rate, even assuming like really kind of quite aggressive scale up around the world, we have of course a lot of new vaccines coming in, then I don't think it's realistic to have anywhere near enough vaccines before end of 2022. And that's even a best case where we don't have the mutations that requires new vaccines, etc. So I think we might need to start thinking about this slightly differently, not so much about when will everyone be vaccinated, but more kind of how do we manage this on an ongoing basis going forward, using vaccines as one of the tools we have, but also combined with a range of other tools.
So looking at the vaccines, when sticking with that, not necessarily covering the world, when can various countries expect to have enough vaccine to cover them? We're here in the UK. They've had a pretty aggressive purchasing of vaccines relative to a lot of other countries. The United States is a little bit slower. Israel, they're hitting critical mass. Who do you think will be the next Israel, and how will that play out?
Yeah, so the two countries that really stand out are the UK and the US, because they have a very strong vaccine portfolio. They have domestic production facilities. They made the right bets, and the UK is rolling out well, and I think we will be seeing also better rollout from the US. The EU is also looking fairly okay 3-4 months after. So basically the sequencing from our predictions is UK and US by the summer, EU somewhat later. And what I'm talking about here is a 75% threshold vaccinations, right, where you have like fairly broad coverage of the population. That's not the same as herd immunity, by the way, but it's getting close to that. So you have those countries. Then you have other let's call rich world countries somewhat later. A country like Japan coming somewhat later in the fall. We have big question marks around China and India. Obviously huge countries with some domestic production, but unlikely to get anywhere near 75% before 2022. And then you have like really big parts of the world, Latin America and Africa, where again, we'll have to look into to 22, and that might even be optimistic.
So what has happened with these countries who've achieved this success? I mean, you mentioned one is domestic production. They're a very different scale, US, UK, and then again, Israel. Maybe mention a little bit about what we've seen in Israel. What is the formula for success? Is it just having that domestic production?
Well, yeah, it's first of all having purchased the right vaccines early on, right? It is important. If you look at what happened last year, the countries that were first out, and that was what US and UK, they went out really early and made a lot of these deals. So they undertook risk early on from the companies, and they're benefiting from that now, right? They took risk, of course, of vaccines that turned out to be successful. So Pfizer and Moderna from the US, AstraZeneca from the UK makes a huge difference. Combining that with domestic production, that's ensuring that they get some of the supply first, is by now the winning formula. Israel is a little bit different. Israel is so much smaller, so they've been lucky to get vaccines. They also paid significantly higher prices for the vaccines than others. I wouldn't say they've jumped the queue, but they managed to get vaccines even though they actually signed some of the deals quite late. And then they've just been phenomenally strong at rolling out. They've really kind of leveraged the military. They leveraged their Teva, one of the a large generics manufacturer that has headquartered in Israel, to really scale up the rollout. If you look at Israel, they might actually get to a supply problem fairly soon because they haven't necessarily all the supplies they need. So you have to be a little look at that as well. But let's see, because it's such a small country, it seems that they're able to strike some deals. They seem also to combine other things in the package with the manufacturers to get them to send them more vaccines early on.
When you say 75%, we're not talking about herd immunity. What is that? Why are you choosing that threshold? And how does that mean? What will it mean for my life? How will my life be different when we hit the threshold that you're choosing to hit there? And how will life return?
So the reason I don't talk about herd immunity, because herd immunity, we don't know enough about whether transmissions will still occur with the vaccines.
So in other words, I have the vaccine, I can still get COVID, but a very low-grade version of it that I can even pass on to others.
Exactly. If that's the case, it would be very hard to achieve herd immunity. The other thing we don't know is how transmittable these new virus strains are, right? So we've seen the UK numbers that they were much more transmittable, and that also raises the bar for herd immunity. So you might need to have more than 80, even 85% vaccinated to achieve full herd immunity. But so I think that's very far off, and it might not be the right goal to set for any countries. But if we say we have 75% vaccinated, and we assume that the vaccine still is fairly effective, around these 90 to 95%, or some maybe even less, then you will see, before that you will see a significant fall in hospitalizations, a significant fall in mortality. And if you look at what is the problem countries are really facing at the moment, it is that in many places the hospital systems are on the verge of breaking point, right? That is really the fundamental biggest issue. That is the reason that you've had these kind of massive lockdowns throughout the world. So the vaccinations, once we start getting them rolling at those numbers, we will see a drop. We're already seeing it a bit in Israel, not in the UK yet, but in 1 to 2 months we will be beginning to see an effect of these vaccinations, and I think that is really the central point. We might then still have to manage there might be local outbreaks, which you might still be at risk of getting it. Even if you have 90%, you still have 10% chance of getting COVID. So we're not going to get rid of COVID-19, right? But we might get it to a level where it is more like a flu or any other infectious disease that we have to be deeply worried about and really have to manage. But we don't have to lock down an entire society.
Okay, so it's a relative opening up is what you're talking about. Life is not going to go back to pre-COVID anytime soon, particularly with the unpredictability of these new strains coming out in terms of their infectiousness and the mortality rates that they're bringing.
Yeah. I think if you look at the societal impact, you have different industries, different activities are associated with very different risks, right? So I think what you will see is that very high risk activities will still be, at least this year, difficult to continue. So let's say, really big festivals, massive traveling across, for high infected areas and things like, some of those things. So some parts of the tourism industry and other things will be impacted throughout the year. But other activities like, can we begin to, can schools open? Can we go back to work? Can we, do outdoor activities and things like that? Will I'm almost 100% certain that will begin to resume in most of the Western world.
Right. Okay, great. So with that vaccine rollout, let's talk a little bit about what is driving the challenge to it. How much of that is a distribution problem, and how much of that is a production problem? And in terms of that, are there certain classes of vaccines that will not face the production or face less of a production problem than others?
Yeah, so I think it depends on which country you look at. It's like, if we could combine Europe and US, we would be in a really good place, because, the US actually has quite a lot of supply, but is not doing rollout really well, right? So their problem is really from a rollout perspective, which has to do with a range of factors, but part of it is that it's a fragmented healthcare system. You have a lot of layers. It's very kind of demand-driven system. So it's just structuring who gets the vaccines when seems to be a challenge many places in the US, and is one of the reasons we're seeing this low rollout. In Europe, on the other hand, rollout is actually in many places, not all, but many countries going really, really well, but there's just not vaccines enough for everyone. So we're facing supply constraints in Europe, and it's back to the point that it is just not possible to scale up production as fast as the world needs. We're talking about numbers that's completely unprecedented, right? We never produced that many vaccines in the world. Some of these are entirely new vaccines, so you have a completely new production system you have to set up for the mRNA vaccines, right? And not even just production, actually to some extent also distribution, because of the severe cold chain requirements.
So what are the supply chain what is the biggest supply chain challenges? I get it, it's obviously the challenge of we're going from something that was really produced at a lab level with RNA until December 2nd, 2020. There was no mRNA vaccine had ever been approved historically. That was first the UK and a week later the US. And so they were basically something that was being produced on lab basis that is now going to a global basis. Yeah. Where are you seeing the biggest constraints in that supply chain?
Well, so I think it makes sense to draw, just very broadly speaking, draw a distinction between the mRNA, which is a chemical process, and then the other vaccines, the viral vectors, the inactivated, and the proteins, which are cell-based. The cell-based one. So
the distinguish is one of them is cell-based. It's grown in a live culture.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other is a combination of something that is sort of built in a more controlled environment.
Yeah, exactly. And so the cell-based with a biological process, it's like you producing a soup, right? The problem we are hearing at the moment is it's from the yield, from the primary problem of the yields from the production facility. So it's basically, you have your whole soup. It's a question of how many vaccines can you then extract from that, and that seems not to be as high as companies had hoped for, and it also takes time to get that right. It's a difficult one to manage, because it can be it's an intricate biological process that can take months to get it right. We're seeing the factories that started early kind of getting higher yields, but some of the factories that began later are struggling. That's also what especially AstraZeneca CEO has been quite transparent and open around that. So that's one problem. The mRNA, I think the issue, there's been some issues with some of the sub-supply, some of the lipid that goes in and binds the mRNA has been mentioned. But I think it's also the bigger problem with that is that it is an entirely new type of production. so we don't have the manufacturing capacity. For the cell-based, you're plugging into a global system that's already existing. That's why if you look at AstraZeneca as numbers, well, they have estimated 3 billion. I think that's quite unrealistic for this year. But there's no doubt that they will be scaling up because they managed to get production agreements throughout the world. They're plugging into especially an Indian setup that's used to producing billions of vaccines. So you can use some of the same setup because it's a well-proven method, more traditional method. We're used to doing this biological. So the mRNA is more difficult and time-consuming because we don't have the system. But I think the really interesting thing to think about here is that if we're looking 1 to 2, 3 years ahead, if we're seeing continuous mutations, which vaccine is then actually long-term going to be the solution? And I think there's a lot of things pointing towards the mRNA vaccines, that once we have built this global production capability for those, and by the way also the distribution, because some of them require cold chain, etc., then that might actually be a stronger candidate for a longer term solution to this problem. If you look at the timing, if you look at what happened last year, from how fast Moderna managed to get the first indications of the new of COVID-19, the numbers out of China, to having the first candidate, I think it was less than a month, right? Remarkably fast. If we can leverage that same time of speed and reaction, it would be really transformational for the world. So I'm actually quite hopeful that we could see a move in that direction.
So it's interesting. Really, it feels like there's a hare, tortoise, hare dynamic going on, which is mRNA was the hare that made it to the finish line to get the first approvals, but is now having that challenge for now in terms of ramping up the production. The cell-based vaccines are now being able to come out, and they will be able to ramp up their production based on their traditional, the infrastructure that is already there. But then once you get the variants involved, it switches back again to the mRNA, where you have that ability to adapt to the new strains moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the interesting things we're seeing at the moment is that you're seeing companies throughout the world now starting to say, well, maybe we could start producing mRNA vaccines, right? So currently the production structure you have is that Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, they're building their own factories. They're taking 100% full control over the entire production chain. And that's because it's a new thing. They want to have that control. But I don't think that's a given that it has to be like that long term. So I think we saw a deal recently in Canada saying, now we will actually start to produce at other places in Europe. I'm also hearing that they're saying, we might start building factories. Other companies, existing pharmaceutical companies, saying this is actually quite interesting. Maybe we could actually be a producer of this and learn from it. So I think those are really, really interesting trends that could point to a next level global capacity for scaling mRNA vaccines.
Fascinating. So we have had that sort of accessibility or production element of that. What about the pricing part on it? Are we going to see radically different prices between all of the different kinds of vaccines?
That's a great question. I think we are seeing radically different prices already, right? So you have Moderna that's priced much significantly higher, and then you have Astra at the other end that's saying we're doing it at cost price. I think what you're going to see is more kind of, let's say, normal market dynamic play in, because it's right now there's a supply constraint, right? So right now you can, if you're Moderna, you can pretty much price it at any price you want. You will be selling it, right? Everyone wants it. But come a year down the line, I think you will see a more competitive pricing dynamic. And by the way, I'm not saying that just for the record, I'm not saying that Moderna is pricing it out of whack. I think they could could have chosen to price it much higher. That would have created a public backlash. I think they've actually found a fairly okay pricing level. I don't think that currently, compared to the price of lockdown, the prices is really not the key challenge for, at least for the Western world. But I think we will see a convergence in pricing that will be also linked up to the efficacy of the vaccine, to the cold storage requirement, and all the other associated costs with the vaccine. If you look at flu vaccines, which I think is a good analogy, you typically see actually fluctuations throughout the year, which is quite interesting. So in the flu season, you can price it much higher, but then it's like, a fish that runs out of date, it's harder to sell after, and then, prices fall. So that similar dynamic, I think we're going to see in, what will we land on? I don't know, but we will probably land on some significantly less than the 20, 30 per dose. We'll probably land on more like a $10 per dose type of pricing, I think, in a competitive space. But I think it would be linked up to the efficacy. So if, let's say, Astra's isn't able to prove higher efficacy than the 65%, maybe people will say continuously we won't be paying as much as we will for higher, more effective vaccine.
Let's talk a little bit about efficacy versus effectiveness, which is a great theme. What is the difference? What is the meaning? What is the importance? And when we look at the different strains that they're going on.
So the efficacy is kind of, we had the clinical trials, right? We have some good understanding on what in this more controlled environment, how effective were these vaccines, and we've seen different numbers. I think we had some very strong numbers from Moderna and Pfizer, also very clear numbers, right? And where AstraZeneca combines several different trials, and therefore it's a little bit harder to interpret. But I think we're looking to soon have the large phase 3 trial in the US coming out, and I think that will give us more clarity. The effectiveness is that then what happens in real life, right? How is it actually playing out? Are we seeing a reduction in hospitalizations and infectious? So what is the real kind of real world effect of that? And that's what we're beginning to see now in Israel and other countries. And that's of course a big question mark, because we know that from other areas that there is often a difference. One thing is what you do in a clinical trial, another thing is
so in some important thing, viewers please note, efficacy clinical, effectiveness real world. And this becomes particularly important now that we have so many variants going out there. And what do we think about what is your take? I mean, we've had a back and forth on this about the results coming out of South Africa. When that trial period was taking place, what portion of that trial period was happening when the new, more deadly variant was prevalent?
Yeah, so there's some discussions around that. I think the key thing to say here is that it was clear from those trials that in places where this South African variant was prevalent, the efficacy was lower, right? So it seems very likely that, and there's also recent studies, a study out yesterday that also seems to indicate that. So some of these variants are lowering the efficacy. Again, back to the flu, it's the same we see in the flus, because flu is much mutating much faster than COVID-19. And there we are seeing vaccines at around 50% efficacy. So the 95 we have is I think with the existing, the big main strain, it's very unlikely that we can keep it on that level as unfortunate as things mutate. So I think that's almost, I wouldn't say a certainty, but it seems very, very likely that the mutations will be lowering how effective the vaccines are. And it might be different from different types of vaccines, and those are some of the things we just don't fully know. But it was striking to see both J&J and Novavax numbers, but they were statistically different from places where the variant was prevalent to where the high risk variant wasn't as prevalent. And so that's going to be a key issue going forward. We will see monitoring in many countries on this. And part of the problem we have is that many countries are actually not doing a lot of genomic testing. So they might have different variants, but you just don't know it. The UK,
part of the unfairness of referring to these as the South Africa strain or the Brazil strain or the UK strain. These are the countries that are doing the testing who are actually finding those strains. So it's actually, they're the ones who found it, not the ones who created it, so to speak.
Exactly. In the scientific circles, there's a big debate on how do we name these variants, by the way. So if any viewers have some good suggestions for that, I think it would be very welcome, because we don't want it to be called the UK. I even heard about the Kent strain yesterday, right? So you don't want that. I think we need better naming conventions for this. But you're right. It is some of it has to do with how good are you actually at detecting it. some of the numbers from the US is like less than 3% of all tests get genomic sequenced, right? So it tells you a little bit about how little we know about it. But UK has built up a capacity for this over the years, and I think is really benefiting from it. I also think the UK's life science industry is benefiting from it because it means that we get early test results. It means that many companies, biotech, pharmaceutical, can use this to start reconfiguring both potential new vaccines or new variants of the vaccines, but also therapeutics. Because a big issue is also that it seems also to indicate that it lowers also the effect of the therapies we have against COVID-19, right? And
okay,
that's...
I'd love to come to the therapies in just a second, because
Yeah.
we've been focusing an awful lot on the vaccines. But one more vaccine question, which is, with these strains coming around, are we moving towards an annual vaccine regime? And looking at the strains, are there ways that we're going to have to, account for, okay, I've been vaccinated against the 135 strain, or however we're naming them, whether we adopt a hurricane naming convention or whatever it is for them. Are we going to have a strain specific / annual vaccination going forward for COVID? Are we hitting endemic COVID?
I think that is very likely. I mean, the short answer is we don't know yet. We don't know how long these vaccines are lasting, for good reason, because we haven't had them for a long time, right? So you need time to tell how long it lasts.
Right. So what you're saying, in other words, we don't even know if this vaccine runs out of efficacy after 9 months.
No, exactly, because we haven't had 9 months, right? So it's kind of an obvious point in some ways, but of course there are scientific indications, one or the other, but some say that there might be T cell memories that makes them quite effective for a long term, but other scientists argue, no, we think we're gonna need a booster ongoing. So I think it's one of the big question marks. It's also one of the really, really big question marks for the companies. Imagine the companies that invested billions in this. If this is a one-off for them, this is a very different market dynamic than if it is an ongoing booster, right?
Right. Okay. Therapeutics. In terms of COVID, there's a number of different ways we can deal with it. One is stopping the transmission. People are wearing masks, social distancing, vaccination sort of stops in its tracks. If you have caught it, you can be treated with therapeutics. We're making advances in all of those domains. Are there advances we should be noting in the therapeutic side?
So I think, first of all, there has been advances already, right? If you see the mortality rate and as a percentage also of hospitalizations, we're seeing a reduction of around at least 20%, and I think 20% can be mostly attributed to better therapies. Also, the timing of the therapies, how you go about it in the hospitals have improved a lot. But some of the steroids, the antivirals have turned out to they're not they're not major breakthroughs that kind of completely treat you, but they have made a really big difference. They have saved significant amount of lives. They work mostly on severe cases, so really kind of when you get to when it gets really bad. That's where they've been most kind of seem to have most effect.
Okay, so the therapeutic advances are not in I'm feeling bad, I take a pill and I'm feeling better. It's more are you going on to intubation, or are we preparing for end of life?
Yeah, exactly, and that's where they made a difference. But then we have the mono antibodies, right? Which there's been a lot of talk about that. That actually has very promising results. It's also a kind of a novel, quite innovative type of vaccine. Type of therapy. It's very expensive, but it could be used prophylactically. So it could be used actually to prevent people from getting it. So people who might not be able to take the vaccines. There's by the way, and that's a different discussion, but there's a large group of people who will never be likely never be able to get the vaccine, immune compromised, pregnant, many groups, and we did some numbers, so there's actually quite a big proportion of the population. So for some of those, we also need therapies, right? So these antibodies have they got a lot of mention when Trump got them, and there's been debate in different countries. They're very expensive. They're very, very expensive treatment. So I think, but they are one of the most promising avenues the researchers are exploring at the moment. The problem is they are costly to produce at scale. So it might be a very kind of, it's definitely a, let's say, rich nation, and maybe even the very wealthy in the rich nation solution. Also because of the way they are administered is very complicated. It has to be in a hospital setting and other things. But they have it's promising, and they have also made a difference. And we're seeing 1,100 different candidates at the moment, like being explored in clinical trials. So there's a tremendous scientific effort going into trying to find better treatments. So I would expect a lot of results coming out this year that will also make a big difference for patients around the world.
With the rollout and on every level going on, sort of moving to a more general question on this, what are the things that could be done to really accelerate getting beyond the pandemic? What are the things that are being done in one country that should be learned by another, or overall, what is a broad failure or something that can be addressed?
Yeah, so I think one of the really difficult things about this pandemic is the country divergence, right? On so many levels, right? There is no poster child, right? There is no country that's done everything right. You have countries that have managed, in Asia, for instance, managed the pandemic from a social distancing, mask, and all of that. Amazingly, you have countries like Australia and New Zealand that has really been good in quarantining, making sure they didn't get the virus in, making sure that the new mutations didn't get in. I think there's a lot to learn from that. So you can pick that from there. You can pick the social distancing from Asia. You can, as we discussed, the rollout is doing really well in a country like Israel. The UK is also really doing its rollout well. Then you have things like on the science side, who's been able to build up the capacity fast. There, I think US and the UK, they're set up with vaccine task force reporting into the top. Lots of leeway for the decision makers to make deals really fast, really speed of essence, not focusing too much on long-winded like procurement details, but really getting money out in the system. So you start building factories in parallel with running trials. Those are really big learnings from those countries. So it's not a very clear answer, I know, but that's because there isn't a clear answer. Countries have been good at different things, and it keeps surprising me, the divergence. Even just look now on infections throughout the world. They are so different. Even within Europe, I was looking at Portugal this morning. Portugal is in a very, very serious situation, right? Hardly any ICU beds. Basically, the hospital system is close to breakdown, right? And you go next door, it's not the same. It's not the same issue. Spain is like, I wouldn't say significantly, but definitely in a better position. You wonder why does that explain? A country like France can't roll out any vaccines. They rolled out like 4,000 vaccines yesterday, which is like nothing, right? Next to the UK, that's rolling out a lot. And it is actually hard to explain fully these differences from your health system, because some of these countries are actually quite similar. And so I think it's puzzling, and it's one of the things that I would I think we should look further into as the world and try to kind of draw the right lessons. But right now it's actually hard to draw some very firm lessons from global response.
Okay, so looking at the medium term, in terms of the next 3 to 5 years, and what about beyond? What are the things what are the lessons that can be taken out of this, projecting further forward?
Well, I think the key lesson is the dangers to the world of a pandemic, right? It's been said before, right? But and there's been warnings for many years, but it hasn't really been taken seriously. If you look at the investment into pandemic response, both scientifically but also the other measures and biosecurity, it has actually been lowered. So I think what we need to see now, we need to see it as, and we already are seeing that, we're seeing a significant different level of investments throughout the world in this. There's also been an underinvestment in vaccine space for many years. Hasn't been a very profitable business to be in vaccines, right? Prices have been quite low. It's been very much used in low income countries with little pricing, and they hadn't had the funding for that. So I think all of that is already changing, and definitely needs to change. The cost to the world of this is like in the trillions, right? So could we spend, hundreds and hundreds of millions in preparedness? Yes, probably be a really, really good idea. And I think I think that is the big learning, the threat that this has to the world, and that you can do things to be better prepared when the next pandemic hits.
Great. Okay, excellent. Are there any final thoughts on what people need to pay attention to? What's coming next?
Well, I think the thing about kind of the efficacy of the different vaccines will play a big difference and role in the countries, because if you just do the numbers of, say, you get everyone to take a vaccine that's 60%, then still have 40%. If you make everyone take 95%, you only have 5% that's susceptible to the virus. That is, I think that there's so much focus on how many vaccines do we get out, but the efficacy and the effectiveness of the vaccine will ultimately determine the trajectory of the countries.
Right, and in that sense, we might actually have to have people revaccinated if we've only got 60 or it's down to 50 for a particular new variant.
Yeah, and you're also seeing, I think we are seeing the first trials now that are combining different types of vaccines, right? In one, so you get one vaccine first and then another vaccine later. I think, for instance, Astra and the Sputnik vaccine is now kind of joining forces in a smaller trial on that. So I think that we will see a lot more of that kind of experimentation.
Interesting. So more cooperation needed across the industry, basically, to make that all happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Rasmus, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion, and look forward to following more as Airfinity brings out all of these incredible statistics about what's happening with the vaccine rollout and the pandemic.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a great discussion.